Apple has just wrapped up WWDC. They've announced their next generation software that's going to power all of their devices coming September, and it's a little bit different this time. Instead of the iOS 19, tvOS 19, let me get this right, macOS 16, watchOS 12, and VisionOS 3 that you would expect, everything is just now 26, with a complete visual overhaul too. Each software is now more aligned with each other and is all inspired by glass and transparency. But here's the thing. Apple is not in a great place right now. Last year was all about Apple Intelligence. They overpromised, they underdelivered. The year before was Vision Pro, which did not create the change I think they thought it would. iOS 18 was like the buggiest Apple software I've ever used. Siri is falling further and further behind as an assistant, and developers just seem to be increasingly frustrated working with Apple. So, is this new software actually fixing Apple's issues, or is it just a shiny coat of paint to try and cover them up? So the first software they talked about is the new iOS 26. They talked about how this is the biggest redesign since iOS 7 back in the day. So I was amping myself up for like a completely new look, and then they revealed it, and it was not that big of a change. Now, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think this liquid glass material that they've introduced is really cool to look at. Like, I think it looks futuristic. And, seeing it across the camera app, the Safari, the way that the tab bar is now more dynamic and kind of disappears into this small bubble, it's pretty clearly the more immersive experience compared to what we have now. And you can tell that Apple has really tried to not make this just look flat, like iOS 7. There's a lot of subtle lighting effects on this glass to make it feel three-dimensional. I assume because they're really trying to prime people for a future that is all about spatial computing, like the Vision Pro. Thing is though, glass can be problematic. Like, you don't want it everywhere. There were a couple of instances at the event, and I'm sure there'll be many in person, where you can start to see how things might be a little bit less clear. Ironically, I feel like these new all-clear icons are a pretty good example of that. They are cool, they just feel like a recipe for intense squinting. It's actually really weird. Like, this whole transparency thing is probably the first time that Apple has moved design language in a way that it doesn't feel like others will follow. We've actually just seen a whole load of companies go in the complete opposite direction. So, ironically, for an event that's designed to help developers, this will probably end up with quite a few of them pulling their hair out, trying to figure out how on earth to redesign their app for a second time just to fit Apple's new design language. Now, there are positives, like the camera app, for example. They've boiled it right back down to the basics again. The same features are still there, they're just hidden now. Maybe a bit less intuitive for someone who's never used an iPhone before, but I'm a big fan. This is very refreshing after years of creeping clutter. The lock screen now has this more dynamic glass-like unlock animation. The time will now fluidly adapt to your wallpaper to try and nestle into your scene, and there is animated lock screen music art. I'm very happy to see that they've used this new look as a chance to slightly fix the mess that they created with the Photos app in iOS 18. But then you look at the new control center compared to the old one, and it just feels like they've moved that mess to other places. So thankfully, iOS 26 is not just here's a new design, see you later. There are some healthy updates, I'd say, to the phone app. There's a more unified layout, which brings together your favorites and your recents and your voicemails. There's the ability for your phone to screen calls before unknown numbers can get to you. Yes, finally, but this one's actually really sick. Hold assist, which means when someone puts you on hold, your iPhone can keep your spot in line. And then it's only when you reach the front of the queue that your phone will ring you as you get through to a person, as if that person was calling you. So much less time nervously hanging around your phone as you try to go about your day. Messages now have customizable backgrounds, which appear for everyone in the conversation. You've got polls in group chats, which I just love how they talked about this. It's like, we're creating this amazing thing. It's exactly what WhatsApp's had for absolutely ages. And on that note, also typing indicators for group chats. It's just good features that lots of people have already had access to on other platforms. The big new one, though, is live translation. So this is integrated into messages, FaceTime, and phone calls, and can all happen on your device without needing any internet at all. So in concept, amazing. Like being able to talk to your Italian grandma and understand what she's saying even though she's talking another language. But having seen what this looks like already on other phones, chances are that the first gen iteration is going to be pretty jank. And then your phone can also use that same tech in Apple Music to translate lyrics so you can actually understand the next Blackpink album. and then give you pronunciation for if you just don't care what it means but you want to sing along. But then it got really strange. So Apple announced a new app for games. This is meant to be your gaming hub. Recommendations of new games you can play, a place to challenge your friends to little competitions and launch games from here. And then also an update to visual intelligence, which now lets you search within what's on your screen, not just what your camera can see. But it was just strange to see this in 2025 when all the stuff that Apple is showing us feels like things that we've seen years ago. Like, this stuff was actually giving me major deja vu from Google events I've watched a long time ago. So I'm also going to rate each of the software updates based on how much of an improvement I think they are. I would say for iOS 26, it deserves a solid but unspectacular 5 out of 10, made slightly better by all the little features buried in the small print, like the ability to select partial text within a bubble, or customize the snooze alarm, or actually a personal favorite of mine, a hint to clean your lens if it's dirty. But the other side to this new software equation is the new naming, how every single software is now just 26. Ultimately, I think it's a good thing. It is a little confusing that they're calling the software that is technically releasing in 2025 the 26 version, but you can kind of see why. Like, if they called it 25, then by the time it gets to January 26, you'd feel like you're using outdated software. So I don't think there's a better way of doing it. But the most important thing is that this allows the average user to actually be able to keep track of whether they're on the latest or not, with, I suppose, the side benefit of potentially taking a little bit of the pressure off Apple with each release needing to feel like some sort of big drop. Okay, so after iOS, then we've got the Apple Intelligence side of things. And it feels like Apple Intelligence has got a little broader, like some of the new features in iOS, like the translations, like the visual intelligence stuff, those are Apple Intelligence features, but it hasn't got deeper. Like, aside from a few new languages, the Apple Intelligence model itself hasn't become more intelligent. There is a silver lining in that Apple is now going to open Apple Intelligence up to developers. Like, they're basically giving out the keys to build apps that can use this AI, even offline, which it's an important first step. They show this example of how a developer could make an app that lets you take a photo of your notes and then use the power of Apple Intelligence to turn those notes into a quiz in one tap, for example. And this is really important. Like, now more than ever, the easiest thing to do is to make a web app. You can build a web app now without even touching a piece of code. And so Apple needs this. Apple needs to try to encourage developers to carry on making really curated apps that are specifically designed around the iPhone and the iPhone's features, and hell, now the iPhone's design language too. The not so great news is that how useful this is strongly relies on how easy they've made it for developers to integrate Apple Intelligence, but also how powerful Apple's offline AI model actually is, which, based on our experiences in iOS 18, is not looking the most promising. If you compare the intelligence of Apple Intelligence versus direct competitors like Galaxy AI, but also indirect competitors like ChatGPT, it's not there. And this feels like it needed to be the event where they convinced us that Tim's been cooking all along. But if anything, it's the opposite. They were vocal about how they're not yet ready to talk about any improvements to Siri and the actual intelligence model itself. You really got the feeling while watching this event that AI is the first time that Apple has really hit a wall. They've struggled to just self-develop the tech the way that they want to do it, and they're having to lean heavily on ChatGPT in all the areas that their own AI just doesn't cut it. And they must hate that. So Apple Intelligence, not a big update at all. 3 out of 10. And pretty similar story with WatchOS. I would say the main change of note is just the design. And that does matter. I would say 50% of people wear watches just for the design. But I gotta say, I did find the new features particularly underwhelming. Like, the watch can now use Apple Intelligence to also, like the phone, live translate messages and improve the intelligence of its smart stack recommendations. But given the watch itself doesn't have Apple Intelligence, it's going to be powered by your phone, so does that create an extra delay when you're trying to use it? There's a new wrist flick gesture you can use to navigate. Maybe that will be helpful. And then the only other thing was Workout Buddy, which gathers all the data from your existing workout, your history of workouts, and uses Apple Intelligence from your iPhone to turn it into a dynamic, energetic voice to inspire you. Hard pass. I was cringing physically during this ad. It's one of the strangest features that I think absolutely zero people asked for. And it's not like they've run out of things to improve. There are plenty of things that Apple should try and improve on the watch, like better quality tracking, the ability to automatically know exactly when you start and when you stop working out, and what workout you are doing based on the types of movements you're making, and maybe even a score for your sleep too. These are important, potentially fundamental features for people. Workout Buddy? Not one of them. 4 out of 10. TVOS, though, was better. First of all, I think this is where the new glass design language really shines. It just makes sense on a TV. Like, this is where you want nothing to get in the way of your content. Plus then, the thing that no one expected, karaoke. You use your iPhone as the microphone, and Apple TV becomes the lyrics. I've always thought that karaoke systems are some of the most wasteful pieces of technology, since you do have all of the ingredients separately in your other gadgets. But this feature cements that. It's a brilliant use of hardware and software that makes Apple TV, in my opinion, even more of a no-brainer than it is. 6 out of 10, just because nothing else really changed outside of that. But I would actually say macOS is the one that surprised me the most, because the Mac is a very mature product category. But even then, it still feels like, with this new software, Apple is trying to actively redesign how you interact with your computer. So it's got the same call screening tools and live translation in messages as the iOS does. It's got the liquid glass design language, which reminds me a little bit of Windows Aero from back in the day, but just more tastefully done. There's quite a bit more customization too, like being able to change the color of your folders and being able to add symbols. They did show some pretty great examples of how you can now personalize it, which I'm not going to complain about. But the key new things for me are continuity. So you can order some food on Uber on your phone, and then you can keep tabs on it and even interact with that app while you're on your Mac. And then Spotlight. So Spotlight has always been the way to get to stuff fast, but they're completely changing it to try and make it the place to do stuff fast. So not just a journey, but the destination too. So for example, being able to access a tool from your Spotlight search that removes the background of an image without needing to open a new app to make that change, which is a little hard to assess without using the new software. But I would say if it feels intuitive, then this is kind of like using ChatGPT to get your answers as opposed to like old school Google search, in that it brings the outcome to you without you needing to navigate into the various rabbit holes to retrieve those results yourself. So it could be a fundamental level up in the way that you interact with your computer. And then finally, a new dedicated games app. Don't get me started with gaming on Mac. It's like the same story every single time. They'll pick like one example of a game that works well on their platforms. They'll act like developers are flooding to their platforms, but in reality, it's just too much work to bring most games over to Mac with not that obvious an upside. But overall, I would give the new macOS a 7 out of 10. And then just before the new iPadOS, which is probably the biggest of the entire bunch, VisionOS, which has hilariously gone from 1.0 to 2.0 to 26. I'd call this a small upgrade, but an important upgrade. You can tell that they're still slowly trying to continue to flesh out what a spatial computing world could look like. You've got new widgets that are more depthy than before, they're more customizable than before, and they stay put exactly where you've placed them, even if you reboot the headset, which like that level of object permanence is very cool. Like this Photos widget almost looks like a window into another world with how solidly it's planted and the depth effect. And speaking of depth, it now has improved tech to be able to better transform your flat 2D images into depthy 3D ones that you can look around. And it can use that same tech in Safari for spatial browsing so that you can actually see inside of the images as you're flicking through. I would say there's a dramatic transformation to personas. You know, the image of you that the Vision Pro can create when you're on a call with someone, the hair, the lashes, the complexion. Considering that the headset isn't actually seeing close to your full face while you're talking, this is eerily good looking. Keyword eerie. And then there's also some new spatial accessories like this Logitech pen that can draw in 3D space and PSVR 2 Sense controller compatibility. But Vision Pro, I mean, just like the Mac, is not currently the place for gamers, especially when you compare it to the Meta Quest. These are all good features, but none of them enough for me to want to pick up my dusty Vision Pro. It definitely feels like they're leaning more into enterprise, maybe having seen it not be such a hit with the consumer market. I'd give it 6 out of 10. But it was IPadOS that really felt like the mic drop moment to this whole event. IPadOS gets pretty much the same treatment every single year. It gets all the new features of the new iOS, but then with a couple of bonus iPad-specific features that just bring it ever closer to being a Mac without ever becoming a Mac. But today felt like Apple just ripped that band-aid off entirely. For starters, with this whole new way to multitask. So you're used to flicking windows up from the bottom to close them, but you can now also grab those windows from the corner to fluidly resize them. And those windows become basically macOS windows that can stay open, and when minimized will just reopen in the same positions that they were left in. You can snap them into the various corners of the screen, like the previous macOS allowed us to do. The pointer is now more precise for when you're using the Apple Magic Keyboard. Demanding tasks like video exports can now happen in the background while you do other things. There's a menu bar on iPad, just like a Mac, all topped off with a revamped system for handling files. In theory, these were all the key areas of complaint with old iPads. These were like the only things that would stop an actually pro user from switching from Mac to iPad, and Apple is addressing all of them. Does that mean you now can switch? Probably not. There will probably be some tiny little grievances, like the lack of loading bars, the lack of supported file types, like random little stuff like that will just about be enough to make that switch too painful for anyone invested in the Mac. But my God, are they flying close to the sun here. And the finishing touch is improvements to audio and video. So your AirPods can now capture your voice clearer and with even more of the voice texture than before. And then for video, when you're on a call, your iPad can now save the full quality video file from your end of that call to the device, which is much better than just screen recording the whole thing, and would actually make it a plausible way to record an interview, for example. So iPadOS? That's a 9 out of 10 upgrade. Subscribe if you want to see what the software's like when I actually get my hands on it.